So good evening, Francis. Should I be polite and call you Francie or Francis? Because I know you as Francie, but your polite Sunday name is Francis McCarran. Which do you prefer?
Uh, Donna, I've been answering to everything for the last 50 years. There was my brother and I in the house, my brother Michael, and we both worked in the family business in Dublin Street in Monaghan. It was a clothes shop, and half the customers who came through the door called me Mickey. And I would answer to that. My mother called me Francis. The neighbours called me Francie, and everyone else who knew me outside Monaghan called me Frank. So,
There you go. Pick a
um,
name and choose it. You don't have to stick with it. That's useful. Well, if it's any consolation, I came from a family of 10 at the first, and then up to 11. So you can just imagine what my mother called me many times. And it wasn't my own first name. She went through the first five or six above me beforehand. So I kind of know what you mean there, getting a different name from different people. We're here to talk, Francie, about the upcoming visit to Monaghan Toastmasters. You've never been to a meeting before, but I thought, well, why don't we engage someone who is in if you're like the widest sector, for want of better words, of public speaking. No better man in various roles that you've been in over the years. You do a lot of public speaking, and at the core of that, as well as a tour guide, you're a storyteller. I mean, that's loosely how I know you, but you've got many more kind of uh, bows and slings and arrows in your quiver bars, or you've got many weapons of use. But that's what you are to probably at the core of it. You're a storyteller.
yeah, it's a bit like when you were asking me about my name at the start, Donna. I've just always been fascinated by stories, and you can hear the same story told, but it will have a different angle on it every time it's told. And whenever a story is told, depending on the teller, you can take something completely different from it than you did on the previous occasion. So I've always been fascinated by stories ever since I was young. I grew up in a house where neighbours would gather and stories would be told. And in those stories, local people and characters would come to life. People I had never met in my life before, but I felt as if I knew them because of the way the neighbours talked about them and how they remembered them. And whenever I grew older in life, I would be telling stories like, for example, we grew up in the shadow of Slieve Bay Mountain. And on Slieve Bay Mountain, there is a crossroads. It's called Courtney's Cross. And at Courtney's Cross, the Lord and the angel met every day of the week, but never on a Saturday or a Sunday. And I was like taken by the deep religious significance of this story. Why wasn't this place as big as Knock? But when you come from North Monaghan, you realise a lot of families have nicknames. And there are a lot of McKennas, and one family of McKennas who lived in Scotstown Village had the unusual nickname of the Angel McKennas. And Jimmy the Angel was the postman for Scotstown area, and his counterpart in Davenant was Jack Lord. And when they would go out on their bicycles on their routes delivering the post, they would meet at Courtney's Cross, and Jimmy would go one direction and Jack would go the other. But all the locals knew that Courtney's Cross was the cross where the Lord and the angel met.
That's beautiful, and it's completely of the place and the space and the time. There are not as many nicknames in my hometown, but there are a few around the Laveries. There's a good story. I couldn't tell you it on air, but it's a good story about a nickname that came with the family name. I actually related to a family called the Laveries. The Laveries have hundreds of Laveries, but they were the Full Laveries, and I'm related to the Full Laveries. The Full Laveries and my mother used to meet in our house. They'd come over at 6 o'clock in the evening, and they talk and they talk and they talk, and it'd come to 9 o'clock, and it was getting a bit dark. It was during the summer. He said, "Oh, well, sure, we'll leave you home now," and they'd walk towards the Lavery's house, which was probably 3 or 4 or 5 miles away. And then when they got halfway, the Lavery's would say, "Oh, sure, Kitty, we'll walk you back to your place." And then they walked home to her place. And then by the time they got there, I said, "Oh, sure, I'll walk you a bit back to your house." And this went on and on and on and on. And when they finally got to halfway point, it was 6 o'clock in the morning and the light had come back into the day that was in it. So not alone were the full Laveries, but Kitty, Marta McKeown was a bit of a fool as well. So the nickname's a good one. That's a good wee story, Francie. Thank you for telling us. But you'd have to have a certain way of being and a certain interest. I mean, everybody knows stories, but it's not everybody that picks up on them or indeed then wants to become the storyteller. I mean, it's a special role, or was a special role in Irish society, wasn't it?
It was. There were very few forms of entertainment for people years ago, because you're looking back at a time when there was no radio, there was no television, there was very little money in the country, so buying musical instruments was expensive. So people had to entertain themselves in some form or other, and a lot of it was entertainment through stories, telling stories or singing songs without music or reciting local ballads and poems. There's a poem from Cavan. Well, it's from Monaghan area, and I always it caught my imagination always. And I'll tell you the poem first, and then I'll tell you why it caught my imagination. The poem is about Ballaconnell Fair. Two brothers bold, called Mick and Pat, they lived near Derry Lynn, and they had a darling springing cow that they called Mary Jane. But hay was scarce and cash was scarce, and both their suits threadbare, so Mary Jane she had to go to Ballaconnell Fair. Now on the morning of the fair there came an awful mist. It rolled down across the hills of Doon till you couldn't see your fist. Says Mick to Pat, you go in front and I'll bring up the rear, and with Mary Jane between us we'll get to Ballaconnell Fair. But at Gortaree, well, Mary Jane she played an awful trick. She slipped into a byroad, unbeknownst to Pat or Mick. She ate a feed from Drum's haystack, and there she made her lair, as Pat and Mick both welted on to Ballaconnell Fair. Now when they reached the town of Ballaconnell, it was coming on daylight, when all at once the mist did lift, and the drovers hove in sight. Says Mick to Pat, where's Mary Jane? I don't see her anywhere. Be the holy God, was it me you drove to Ballaconnell Fair? Well, both men's dead now, Lord rest their souls, but still their stories told, around the firesides in Derry Lynn, well loved by young and old. And children on their way to bed, whilst racing up the stair, still ask, was it Pat drove Mick, or Mick drove Pat to Ballaconnell Fair?